Hi there, and welcome to another Pearced Off, the counter-apologetics segment from myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, for the Skepticule Podcast. This week I'm going to talk about some fundamental philosophy, and it kind of annoys me quite often when people talk philosophy. So, for example, on popular religion, politics and sort of philosophy program called The Big Questions on the BBC on Sunday morning, they talk about, was it right to torture here? Do you have to be religious to be moral, and this and that, and all these kind of really big questions. And they argue on the veneer, up here on the surface, and they say, well, yes, and they argue either way, and they get these panelists to discuss it and then put it out to the audience, and they never really get to the core fundamental issues, which is a philosophical necessity to really be able to establish your case. And I want to talk today about those fundamentals of philosophy, and in fact, these are abstract ideas. So the idea of whether an abstract idea exists in some kind of objective reality or not. Now, I'm going to lay my cards on the table. I'm what you would call a conceptualist or a conceptual nominalist. So I deny the existence of abstract ideas. And I do that on the basis of some thought which I'm going to go through now. And this has really big implications for everything from morality to things like the clown cosmological argument and whether certain things and labels objectively exist. So let's think about something like a chair. Now we might say that this chair here began to exist. So what do we mean by, what exactly began to exist? Well, all those molecules pre-existed the beginning of this chair, and as a result, there's no thing came into being. So what came into being was this label, this abstract idea that I ascribe to this collection of molecules, and I call it a chair. Now, the question is, does chair as a label exist objectively? And by objectively, I mean mind independently. So, is there this idea of chair out there in some kind of other dimension, abstract dimension? So, Plato gave rise to the school of thought of Platonic realism. So, the idea that there were these perfect forms of these real things in an abstract sense. Now, I deny Platonic realism or realism in general with regards to these kind of ideas. So the chair, this particular chair, does it exist objectively? If I cut maybe one of the legs off, or half a leg off, or 1,000 molecules, or one molecule, or if I added to it, is it still a chair? And is it a chair to someone in an Amazonian tribe who might look at that and say, oh, that makes if I lie that down, that makes a really good bed or something. So therefore, you're really playing with the idea of what is real in abstract terms. What is real about this? And is it just a bunch of concepts that we have individually in our heads, and a lot of us agree on because we come from the same culture and because we have very similar brains, but in reality there is only a kind of consensus agreement. It doesn't really exist objectively. So an alien that came down a cat would have a different concept of what this thing really is. And if you believe in some kind of Platonic realism, does that mean that every concept a human can possibly conceive of has to somehow pop into existence? So that seems just a wholly bizarre idea. So therefore, is there this universal idea of maybe chairness that exists? And again, for very similar reasons, I can't really see how this abstract universal idea of chairness would exist out there in this abstract realm. So I see these things as fundamentally conceptual. So we humans have these concepts in our brain, but of course this idea that they're merely concepts in our brain coheres really well with the data that we have, which is we all generally disagree on a lot of things. So whether that be what a hero is, right, that's an abstract idea. I might think a hero is this kind of person, and the next person might think a hero has a completely different idea of a hero. Someone might think a hero is someone in war that goes around killing lots of people, and someone else might think it's someone that fights for human rights in this and that context. So we disagree fundamentally on a lot of, almost every concept concept you can imagine, which kind of plays into the notion that these concepts aren't real in an objective sense, but are conceptual inside our individual heads. Now, of course, and I'm rushing through this, and it is really, really complicated, so this idea of nominalism, a denial of abstract ideas and universals, is a very complex philosophical area, which is probably why people don't get into it as much, and you get onto things like trope theories, particulars, instantiation, natural kinds, existence properties, and all these kind of very confusing things. But let me just say that I think it's the most reasonable conclusion personally is that of nominalism or conceptual nominalism, such that these things don't exist. The reason why I think it's fundamental, and in fact, you see these discussions on TV or debates, and they argue on the veneer, as I said, talking about, well, this is real, is it wrong to murder a baby, is it objectively, and no one likes to admit that it's not objectively wrong to murder a baby, but they don't actually look at what does it mean to say something is objectively wrong. What is an objective moral law made of? Ontologically, existence-wise, what is it? And this is why it's so important to start really from the building bricks of philosophy and build upwards, and you reach your conclusions after doing that. There's no point starting with a conclusion, I think it must be objectively wrong to murder babies, so therefore that's going to be my axiom and everything else is going to form from around that in philosophy. That's the wrong way of doing it. In my opinion, you should work out what your building bricks are, and once you've defined what your building bricks are, you can work out the rest of philosophy. So when we look at morality, when we say this is a moral law, it's objectively morally wrong to do that, of course, it's kind of meaningless if the sense of objective morality or a moral law is by its very definition a concept. It's an abstract concept, and by being an abstract concept, it doesn't objectively exist. So how can you establish something as objectively a moral law if the very concept of an objective moral law is incoherent? So I would deny the existence of objective morality and in a sense be a moral nihilist. Now, it's not to say that, therefore anything goes. What that means is we build up our moralities individually and conceptually, and because we have very similar brains and because most of us have some kind of understanding of reasoning and logic, we often arrive at similar moral laws and moral value systems. Of course, that really well explains why we also disagree a lot and why certain different cultures with their different contexts will disagree on moral laws and moral value systems. And what we have to do is agree using logic and rationality to have the best moral value system, which will often result from setting out some axioms at the beginning, like the self-evident pleasure of happiness, if you like. So that's why that's a good thing to start with, because it's good to be happy. That seems to be a fairly self-evident axiom. And if you can start setting out your axioms, then things fall into place. And I would say that there is a universal morality by point of fact that if we all had similar neurotypical brains that had a good access to robust knowledge and to a good understanding of reasoning and logic, then we would all find the same things morally good and other things morally bad. We would have a general agreement of that. But of course, we're not all neurotypical. We do not all have good knowledge, and we are certainly not all very good at using logic and reasoning. So that's why there's a lot of difference. But essentially, it's the job of philosophy to establish a good moral value system and say, look, this is a kind of universally acceptable moral value system, even though essentially it's conceptual and exists in our heads. I've spoken for 10 minutes now, so it's a long one, but it's really fundamental, and in fact will play into a lot of what I will say in future, and it's a really, really important point and part of philosophy which often goes completely untouched by actually a lot of other philosophers, and certainly theists and atheists arguing about morality, arguing about this, does this exist objectively, and that term objective comes up and up, but actually mind independence. If there were no minds on earth, if there are no humans, could we ascribe A, beauty to anything, and B, moral value to anything? It's sort of like if there's a sound in the woods, no one that is there to hear it, is there really a sound? But that plays really well into if there are no minds, can you have an objective sense of anything? So abstract and conceptual, can you have an objective morality? So Lots to possibly think about. As ever, question everything and drop by my blog at